Before the USSR, there was the Russian Empire. This empire was vast, stretching across 2 continents. It was ruled by a czar, an emperor with immense power. For centuries, the Romanov dynasty had held this power. However, by the early 20th century, Russia was facing serious problems. Many people were unhappy with the czar's rule. They lived in poverty and had few rights. The country was struggling to modernize. World War I added tremendous strain, pushing the empire to its breaking point. Millions suffered, and the desire for change grew stronger every day. The year 1917 was a turning point for Russia. 2 revolutions swept through the country that year. The February Revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. A provisional government took charge, but it was weak. Then in October, the Bolsheviks seized power. They were a radical socialist group led by Vladimir Lenin. Lenin promised peace, land and bread to the suffering people. His message resonated with many workers and soldiers. This October Revolution marked the true beginning of a new era, one that would reshape Russia and the world. Following the Bolshevik victory, a brutal civil war erupted. It lasted for several years, from 1917 to 1922. The Bolsheviks, known as the Reds, fought against various anti-Bolshevik forces, the Whites. Foreign powers also intervened, trying to stop the spread of communism. Despite these challenges, the Bolsheviks eventually triumphed. In December 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or USSR, was formally established. It initially consisted of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation. This new state was founded on communist ideology, a radical departure from the old imperial system. The creation of the USSR was a momentous event. It aimed to be a state for workers and peasants. Its ideology was based on the teachings of Karl Marx. The Soviet government quickly began to transform the country. They nationalized industries and land. They promoted atheism and sought to create a new Soviet culture. The early leaders believed they were building a utopian society. This new nation, born from revolution and war, set out to challenge the existing world order. Its formation promised a different future, not just for its own people but potentially for all humanity. The USSR was enormous, spanning Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. It was the largest country by land area, rich in natural resources. The population was diverse, with many ethnic groups and cultures. Managing this diversity was a challenge for Soviet leadership. The USSR quickly became a significant global player. It represented a powerful ideological challenge to the West. The world was divided into 2 camps, leading to the Cold War. The USSR's ambition defined much of 20th century history. It inspired both hope and fear, leaving an indelible mark. The USSR projected strength, but internal complexities existed. The communist ideal of a classless society was hard to achieve. Economic planning often led to shortages and inefficiencies. Political dissent was suppressed and individual freedoms were limited. The state controlled most aspects of life. Beneath the surface of official propaganda, tensions simmered. These issues contributed to major changes. The system contained seeds of its own transformation. It was a grand experiment with profound consequences. This essay will explore the USSR's entire lifespan. We will look at its peak and decline. Economic stagnation, political rigidity, and growing calls for freedom played a part. Events like the war in Afghanistan and the Chernobyl disaster exposed weaknesses. Eventually, the system could no longer sustain itself. The late 1980s and early 1990s were a period of dramatic upheaval. Understanding this collapse is crucial to understanding modern Russia. The fall of the USSR in 1991 was a watershed moment. It marked the end of the Cold War. It also led to the emergence of 15 independent nations. The largest of these was, and is, the Russian Federation. The transition from a communist superstate to a new Russia was not easy. It involved immense political, economic, and social challenges. The country had to redefine its identity and its place in the world. This period of change was turbulent and often painful for its citizens. The legacy of the Soviet era continues to shape Russia today. Our journey through this essay aims to be clear and informative. We will trace the path from the USSR's ambitious beginnings. We will cover its decades as a global superpower. We will then delve into its surprising and swift dissolution. Finally, we will look at how modern Russia emerged from the Soviet shadow. The story of the USSR and its transformation into Russia is a vital part of recent history. It helps us understand the geopolitical landscape we see today. It is a story of power, ideology, change, and resilience. After the devastating Russian Civil War, the new Soviet state faced enormous challenges. The economy was in ruins. Widespread famine and disease plagued the population. Vladimir Lenin introduced the new economic policy in 1921. It allowed peasants to sell surplus crops and small businesses to operate. Lenin's declining health led to a power struggle. Trotsky, Stalin, and others vied for control. Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals and consolidated power. He launched the first five-year plan in 1928, focusing on rapid industrialization. Stalin also forced collectivization, leading to widespread resistance and famine. Section 2. The Iron Grip. Stalin's era of transformation and terror. Under Stalin, the Soviet Union became a totalitarian state. The Communist Party exerted absolute control. Life was subject to state direction and surveillance. A cult of personality was constructed around Stalin. He was portrayed as an infallible leader. Propaganda glorified his image and achievements. No dissent was tolerated. The NKVD became an instrument of state terror. The Great Purge saw waves of arrests and executions. Millions were targeted, including old Bolsheviks and ordinary citizens. Many were accused of being enemies of the people. Countless individuals were sent to the Gulag. Fear permeated Soviet society. Despite the human cost, Stalin's policies led to rapid industrialization. The five-year plans increased production of coal, steel, and electricity. New industrial cities and infrastructure projects were built. The Soviet Union transformed into a major industrial power. This industrial might prove crucial in the coming years. Progress was achieved through coercion and exploitation. The focus on heavy industry often neglected consumer goods. Social and cultural life was rigidly controlled. The state promoted socialist realism in art. Artists had to glorify communism. Education expanded, improving literacy rates. The state aimed to mold loyal, hardworking citizens. Individuality was suppressed in favor of collective identity. The Soviet Union's transformation came at a great human cost. Stalin's era was marked by both progress and terror. The legacy of Stalin's rule remains complex and controversial. The impact of his policies is still felt today. Stalin's era reshaped the Soviet Union and the world. Section 3. The Great Patriotic War and the Dawn of the Cold War. As the 1930s ended, war loomed over Europe. In August 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. This was known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The fragile peace shattered on June 22, 1941, with Operation Barbarossa. For the Soviet people, this marked the beginning of the Great Patriotic War. Pivotal battles like Stalingrad turned the tide. The Red Army began its advance towards Berlin. The Allied victory in 1945 reshaped the global landscape. The Soviet Union emerged as a superpower, but the Cold War had begun. Economic stagnation and social discontent. By the 1970s, the Soviet economy showed serious strain. The centrally planned system struggled to adapt. Innovation was stifled, and shortages became common. People stood in long queues for basic goods. The arms race with the US burdened the budget. Social discontent was brewing beneath the surface. Many compared their lives to those in the West. The promise of a communist utopia seemed distant. Education and healthcare were accessible, but freedoms were restricted. Desire for greater liberties grew. Subtle forms of dissent began to emerge. An underground culture of samizdat developed. Dissidents spoke out against human rights abuses. Figures like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn symbolized resistance. Nationalist sentiments resurfaced in the republics. Ethnic groups yearned for greater autonomy. This period is known as the era of stagnation. The ruling elite resisted meaningful reform. Section 2. The Winds of Change. Gorbachev's Reforms, Glasnost, and Perestroika. In March 1985, a new, younger leader came to power in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Communist Party. He recognized the profound economic and social problems plaguing the country. Gorbachev believed that bold reforms were necessary to revitalize the system. He introduced two key policies: perestroika, meaning restructuring, and glasnost, meaning openness. His aim was to modernize Soviet communism, not to dismantle it. Perestroika was Gorbachev's attempt to reform the struggling Soviet economy. It aimed to move away from the rigid central planning system. Some elements of market-like mechanisms were introduced. State enterprises were given more autonomy in their decision-making. The reforms also allowed for the creation of small private businesses, known as cooperatives. However, Perestroika faced many challenges and resistance from entrenched bureaucrats. The reforms initially caused more economic disruption than improvement. Alongside economic restructuring, Gorbachev introduced glasnost. This policy aimed to increase transparency in government institutions and activities. It also allowed for greater freedom of speech and the press. For the first time in decades, the media began to report more openly and critically. Previously, taboo subjects were discussed publicly. Glasnost unleashed a wave of information and debate. While intended to build support for reforms, it also opened the floodgates for criticism of the entire Soviet system. Gorbachev also initiated significant political reforms. He sought to democratize the Soviet political system. In 1989, elections were held for a new legislative body, the Congress of People's Deputies. Section 3. The unraveling key events and the final collapse. Several critical events during the late 1980s exposed the deep flaws within the Soviet system. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster in April 1986 was a major turning point. The accident itself, and the government's initial attempts to cover it up, severely damaged public trust. It highlighted the dangers of secrecy and the technological shortcomings of the system. Another significant factor was the ongoing war in Afghanistan. This costly and unpopular conflict, which had begun in 1979, drained Soviet resources. It also led to widespread disillusionment, particularly among returning veterans and their families. The policy of glasnost inadvertently fanned the flames of nationalism across the Soviet republics. Long-suppressed ethnic identities and historical grievances came to the forefront. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were at the vanguard, demanding greater autonomy and then outright independence. Their declarations of sovereignty challenged Moscow's authority directly. Similar movements gained momentum in other republics including Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Ethnic conflicts also erupted in several regions. The central government under Gorbachev struggled to manage these powerful centrifugal forces. In August 1991, a dramatic event threatened to reverse the reforms. A group of hardline communist officials attempted a coup d'état. They placed Gorbachev under house arrest while he was on vacation in Crimea. The coup plotters aimed to restore the old order. However, the coup was poorly organized and met with widespread public opposition. Boris Yeltsin, the recently elected president of the Russian Republic, famously defied the coup leaders from atop a tank in Moscow. The coup collapsed after just 3 days, but it fatally weakened Gorbachev's authority. The failure of the August coup accelerated the USSR's demise. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned as president of the USSR. Section 1. The dawn of a new Russia. Yeltsin's era begins. The Soviet Union officially ceased to exist on December 25, 1991. On that historic day, the red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin. In its place, the white, blue, and red tricolor of Russia was raised. The Russian Federation, or simply Russia, emerged as the internationally recognized successor state to the USSR. Boris Yeltsin, who had been elected president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic earlier in 1991, became the first president of the newly independent Russia. He faced the monumental task of guiding the country through an incredibly complex and uncertain transition period. The immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse was a period of profound upheaval. The old centralized political structures of the Communist Party were gone. New institutions of governance had to be created from scratch. This included establishing a new framework for a multi-party democracy and a market economy. Russia inherited most of the Soviet Union's assets, including its vast nuclear arsenal and its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. However, it also inherited deep economic problems and a society struggling to adapt to rapid changes. The sense of sudden freedom was mixed with widespread anxiety about the future. One of the most immediate and controversial policies was shock therapy. This was a set of radical economic reforms launched in early 1992. The goal was to quickly transform Russia's centrally planned economy into a market-based one. Price controls on most goods were lifted almost overnight. State-owned enterprises were slated for privatization. The architects of this plan, including Yegor Gaidar, hoped for a swift transition. They believed that rapid, decisive action was necessary to prevent a return to the old system. The initial impact, however, was a dramatic surge in prices, wiping out the savings of millions. For ordinary Russian citizens, the early 1990s were incredibly difficult. Hyperinflation made their rubles almost worthless. Section 2. Forging a nation, political turmoil and a new constitution. The early years of the Russian Federation were marked by intense political struggles. Boris Yeltsin's government pushed for radical reforms. However, it faced strong opposition from the existing parliament, the Supreme Soviet. This political confrontation reached a dramatic climax in October 1993. President Yeltsin unconstitutionally dissolved the Supreme Soviet. The standoff escalated into violent clashes on the streets of Moscow. Yeltsin ultimately ordered the military to shell the parliament building. Following the resolution of the 1993 crisis, a new constitution was drafted and approved by a referendum in December of that year. Section 3. Economic roller coaster shock therapy and its deep impact. The ambitious program of economic shock therapy had profound and lasting consequences. The rapid liberalization of prices led to hyperinflation. This wiped out the savings of ordinary citizens almost overnight. Simultaneously, the government embarked on a massive privatization campaign. Initially, this involved distributing vouchers to citizens which could theoretically be exchanged for shares in state-owned enterprises. The aim was to create a broad class of private property owners quickly. However, the process was often chaotic and poorly understood by the general public. Many people sold their vouchers for very little cash, desperate to make ends meet. A subsequent phase of privatization, known as loans for shares, proved even more controversial. In the mid-1990s, the government, facing severe budget deficits, allowed a small group of well-connected businessmen to acquire controlling stakes in some of Russia's most valuable state companies. These companies were primarily in the natural resources sector, like oil and gas. In exchange, these businessmen provided loans to the government. This scheme led to the rapid creation of a class of super-rich individuals, often referred to as oligarchs. They amassed enormous fortunes and gained significant political influence. The transition to a market economy was also accompanied by a surge in organized crime and corruption. The weakening of state institutions and the rapid, often unregulated privatization created numerous opportunities for illicit enrichment. Criminal gangs became involved in various sectors of the economy. Corruption became endemic at many levels of government and business. This environment made legitimate business difficult and deterred foreign investment. The old Soviet system, despite its flaws, had provided a degree of order and predictability. The new, often lawless capitalism of the 1990s created a sense of insecurity and injustice for many ordinary Russians. The Russian economy experienced a severe downturn throughout much of the 1990s. This culminated in the Russian financial crisis of August 1998. Section 1. A fractured giant new nations emerge in Europe. The collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 redrew the map of Eastern Europe. 15 independent states emerged from the former superpower. In Europe, this meant the rebirth of some nations and the creation of new geopolitical realities. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had been forcibly incorporated into the USSR in 1940. They were among the first to declare independence and vigorously pursued international recognition. Their journey back to full sovereignty was a powerful symbol of the Soviet Empire's demise. These nations quickly reoriented themselves towards Western Europe, seeking to integrate with its institutions. Ukraine, the second most populous Soviet republic after Russia, declared its independence in August 1991. This was confirmed by a referendum in December of that year. The emergence of a large, independent Ukraine fundamentally altered the balance of power in Eastern Europe. It possessed significant agricultural and industrial resources, as well as a crucial Black Sea coastline. Belarus also became independent, though it maintained very close political and economic ties with Russia. Moldova, located to the southwest of Ukraine, faced its own challenges. including a separatist movement in its Transnistria region, creating ongoing instability for the new state. The dissolution of the USSR also meant the end of its dominance over Eastern Bloc countries. The Warsaw Pact, the military alliance of Soviet-led communist states, had already officially dissolved earlier in 1991. Comecon, the Soviet bloc's economic organization, also ceased to exist. These former satellite states, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, which later split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, were now free to determine their own foreign policies. Many of them eagerly sought closer relationships with Western Europe and the United States. They began processes to join organizations like NATO and the European Union. For these newly independent European states, the path forward was complex. They had to build new democratic institutions and transition their economies from communism to market-based systems. This often involved painful reforms and social adjustments. Issues of national identity, minority rights, and border definitions also came to the fore. Establishing new relationships with Russia, their large and powerful neighbor, was a critical and often delicate task. The early years of independence were a period of enormous change, filled with both opportunity and considerable uncertainty for millions of people across the newly reshaped European continent. The Soviet collapse led to new independent states in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan regained sovereignty. However, the transition was not peaceful. The Caucasus had complex ethnic diversity. The Soviet system managed these tensions. With the central authority gone, conflicts erupted. These conflicts shaped early independence. 5 Central Asian republics also gained independence. These nations had been part of the Soviet Union. They possessed significant natural resources. They were strategically important to global powers. Tajikistan faced a civil war from 1992 to 1997. The dawn of the 21st century brought significant changes to Russia. Vladimir Putin's rise marked a departure from the turbulent 1990s. His focus was on restoring stability and centralizing power. Moscow reasserted its authority over regions and key economic assets. The economy turned around, fueled by soaring oil and gas prices. This new revenue allowed the government to settle debts and increase state funds. Funds were directed towards social programs and military modernization. Russia's economic strength grew, making its foreign policy more assertive. The military saw substantial improvements, projecting power beyond its borders. Russia's relationships with Western nations have been multifaceted and frequently strained. The United States, NATO, and the European Union have often found themselves at odds with Moscow. A major point of contention has been the eastward expansion of NATO. Russia views this expansion as a direct threat to its national security. Disagreements over democratic processes, human rights, and international conflicts have deepened these divisions. Western sanctions, particularly after 2014, have significantly impacted economic ties. These sanctions have fostered deep mistrust between Russia and many Western capitals. In response, Russia has actively pursued a pivot to the east, focusing on China. This strategy has strengthened its partnership with China. This alignment now includes close cooperation in political, economic, and military spheres. Both nations share a vision of a multipolar world order and concerns about U.S. dominance. Bilateral trade has increased, joint military exercises are conducted, and they coordinate their diplomatic positions. Russia continues to regard the post-Soviet space as a region of vital strategic importance. Moscow endeavors to maintain its influence in these neighboring countries through various mechanisms. The Collective Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, serves as a military alliance for several post-Soviet states. The Eurasian Economic Union, EEEU, aims to promote economic integration within the region. However, Russia's dominant influence has faced numerous challenges. Some former Soviet republics have pursued closer relationships with Western countries or China. Recent conflicts and unrest in the Caucasus and Central Asia have tested Russia's role as the primary security guarantor. As one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, Russia retains a significant role in global governance. It actively participates in discussions and decisions on a wide range of international issues. These include counterterrorism efforts, nuclear non-proliferation treaties, and climate change. Moscow often presents perspectives and proposals that differ from those of Western powers. Looking ahead, Russia faces several long-term domestic challenges. These include demographic trends, the need for economic diversification beyond reliance on energy exports, and ongoing technological competition. The nation's rich and complex historical legacy continues to shape its contemporary identity and its aspirations on the global stage today. The nation's rich and complex historical legacy continues to shape its contemporary identity and its aspirations on the global stage today. The nation's rich and complex historical legacy continues to shape its contemporary identity and its aspirations on the global stage today. The journey from the Russian Empire's demise to modern Russia is profound. It began with revolutionary zeal, leading to the birth of the USSR. The USSR was a grand experiment in social and political engineering. It aimed to create a new society based on communist ideals. For decades, this superstate influenced the globe. It engaged in ideological struggles shaping the 20th century. The Soviet Union's story is one of power and dramatic change. This complex past laid the groundwork for modern Russia. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was seismic. It marked the end of an era and the Cold War. The transition period was challenging for newly independent Russia. Years of political instability and economic hardship characterized the 1990s. The nation struggled to forge a new identity. Building new democratic institutions and a market economy was monumental. This upheaval left lasting impressions on the Russian psyche. The legacy of this journey influences contemporary Russia. The Soviet past casts a long shadow over its political culture. Debates about the USSR's achievements and failures remain alive. This history informs Russia's national interests and international relations. The quest for a strong sovereign state is a recurring theme. This is a response to the post-Soviet years' perceived weaknesses. Modern Russia navigates its path, interacting with its heritage. Reflecting on this journey reveals enduring lessons. It shows the power of ideas to shape nations and the world. It highlights the complexities of societal transformation and nation-building. The story underscores the resilience of ordinary people. Russia today continues its evolution, shaped by its history. Understanding this past is crucial. It helps interpret Russia's actions and its role in the world.